2:17 in the morning on April 15th, 1912. Inside the engine room, the temperature pushes past 122 degrees Fahrenheit, while the North Atlantic, water outside sits at a freezing 28 degrees. Brutal water pressure invades the steel compartments, tearing through the hull after that fatal sideswipe. Deep below deck, 8 engineers manually operate the massive boiler valves. The physical toll is unimaginable, and exhaustion is etched into their ordinary, tense faces. They are fighting against all odds to prevent an explosion, desperate to keep the power running for the top deck for as long as humanly possible. But what the passengers in the lifeboats do not know is this. Exactly 11 minutes ago, the single hatch that offered a chance of escape for these men was sealed shut. One direct, silent order locked in the destiny of the entire crew. For 114 years, the depths of the Atlantic Ocean have kept a total, eerie silence about what truly happened on the lowest deck of history's most famous ship. When we picture the memory of April 15th, 1912, our minds almost always drift to the upper decks. We remember the grand staircase at the bow, glowing beneath its massive glass dome. We remember the band playing on, keeping time under a star-filled sky. We picture the tragic shortage of lifeboats and the sheer human desperation. But there is a narrative that remains submerged, a story hidden from the eyes of the world, and even from the passengers fighting to survive. The physical space of the engine room was not just a backdrop for the final collapse. It was the stage for a conscious, silent choice. What unfolds right now is the exact reconstruction of that confined space, a place never fully seen again, and the final journey of 8 senior engineers. These were serious, ordinary men, hardened by over a decade of life at sea, who made the ultimate choice not to back down. They knew that the underwater scraping against the iceberg had dealt a fatal blow to the 46,000-ton giant. Even so, they kept working the heavy machinery, ensuring the electrical grid would not fail. While 200 extra lives earned a seat in a lifeboat thanks to the borrowed time of those burning lights, the crew in the bowels of the ship faced a lethal contrast. They were caught between unbearable heat and the brutal rush of 28-degree water. The engineering department was a colossal structure, housing 280 men, from stokers to coal trimmers and greasers. Yet, in the darkest, most critical moment of that night, these 8 engineers held the front line. And the most heart-wrenching detail of this timeline is this: the order to seal their only escape route, done to protect the upper levels, never reached the ears of the men turning the valves at the bottom of the hull. To grasp the absolute weight of those final hours, we have to leave the safety of the upper deck. We need to leave behind the majestic silhouette of the 4 towering smokestacks, knowing that only 3 of them actually vented boiler smoke, while the 4th was built for ventilation and sheer aesthetics. From here, our path goes strictly down. We are going to penetrate the metallic labyrinths, stepping into the beating heart of the vessel. This is where the electric light made its final, desperate stand against the dark ocean. Following this truth requires an analytical eye and a deep respect for historical memory. Consider subscribing to support the continuous rescue of essential narratives left behind by time. The unraveling of these facts begins where it all started, in the shipyards of Belfast in 1911, revealing how the brilliance of the ship's own design forged an inescapable trap. To understand how 8 men became trapped in the dark, we have to turn the clocks back to May 31st, 1911. The setting is the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Rising up was a steel silhouette that defied human scale. The 46,000-ton ocean liner was taking shape. It was an industrial marvel designed to displace 60,000 tons of water with a grace that seemed to defy physics. When we look at the exterior, with its dark hull contrasting the sheer size of its 4 main smokestacks, we get a feeling of absolute control. But the true soul of the ship did not live in the ornate lounges meant for high society. It lived deep below, in a space built by workers who installed two massive triple expansion engines and a low-pressure turbine. These reciprocating engines stood nearly 30 feet tall, forming the largest propulsion systems ever built at the time. Down there, the mechanical heart was meant to beat forever. However, the sheer scale of this design hit a protocol that would quietly seal the engineering team's fate. On the drafting tables of the naval architects, fire safety was the primary, almost exclusive concern for the lower decks. To protect the ship from coal bunker and machinery fires, they engineered a complex ventilation system, a system entirely reliant on continuous electrical power. The logic from the White Star Line was straightforward, and on paper it seemed foolproof. If a sudden, drastic power failure hit that section, the system would read the blackout as a critical fire. The immediate automated response was to trigger the sealing of 4 vital containment hatches. Heavy steel doors would slide down to the floor. The goal was noble: to choke out any flames by cutting off the oxygen supply, isolating the danger. The problem is that the engineering of 1911 built the perfect defense against fire, but created a deadly trap against the ocean. If the power loss came not from flames, but from a sudden rush of water knocking out the local generators, those same doors would drop without mercy. Anyone operating the machinery below the containment line would be locked in, and they would not be trapped by the force of the ocean, but by the very safety technology designed to protect the decks above them. Not a single one of the 15,000 workers who built the ship questioned this layout. On the Belfast docks, nobody demanded independent emergency stairs or alternative exits leading straight out of the boiler rooms. In the mindset of that era, there was no conceivable scenario where engineers would need to abandon their posts while the boilers were still active and pressurized. They blindly believed the ship could withstand the sea for hours, no matter what happened. And it was exactly this overconfidence that sailed with the ship when it left the yard. It was a monumental feat of iron and steel, where safety protocols were drawn up to protect the machinery and the passenger decks. They simply never factored in escape routes for the men running the engines down below. The seed for what happened in that engine room was not planted on the night of the Atlantic collision. The endgame for those 8 men was quietly drafted during those weeks of assembly on the docks. A tiny detail in the safety circuits lay dormant, just waiting for nature to wake it up. The silence right after the impact lasted only a fraction of a second. Just after 11:40 at night, the metallic groan of the buckling hull was swallowed by the deafening roar of seawater breaching Boiler Room 6. Frederick Barrett, working the front line as the second assistant engineer, witnessed the exact moment the North Atlantic shattered the steel barrier. Salt water blasted in with indescribable violence, bursting through an open gash roughly 1.5 feet off the metal floor. The emergency lights began to flicker, casting an oppressive red glow over the smoke-filled room. At the same time, alarms blared, signaling the imminent closing of the watertight doors. Up on the bridge, nearly 100 feet above the keel, Captain Smith tried to gauge the damage. Just 6 minutes after the crash, a crucial decision was made. Backed by an early damage report and an unshakable faith in modern technology, he concluded that pumping out the ballast water would stabilize the ship. The order sent down the telegraphs, and internal phones was clear and direct. The engineering crew must maintain maximum pressure in the boilers. Smith's goal was to keep traction, letting the ship limp forward until dawn, when a visual rescue would be much more likely. That order, handed down from the cold distance of the command bridge, sealed the fate of the men below. Posthumous letters from Barrett, brought to public light in 1985, reveal the blind obedience and the intense physical cost of that command. By keeping the furnaces fed and the steam pressure pushed to the limit, the 8 senior engineers surrendered any chance of an immediate escape. The scene down there was dominated by exhausted, genuine faces, hard-working men toughened by the grind, with no time for hesitation or dramatic goodbyes. There was only pure tension on their soot-stained, sweating faces, turning manual valves while the freezing water level rose without mercy. The physics of the room quickly became impossible to survive. The clash between the salt water dropping fast to 28 degrees Fahrenheit and the furnaces running at full blast created a suffocating atmosphere. The acoustics of the room were filled entirely by a relentless, heavy, mechanical hum. There were no human voices, no echoing shouts, just the roar of metal under extreme stress. The ventilation, relying on generators now drowning in the flood, began to fail. Modern calculations show that under those extreme working conditions, the engine room would hit a lethal temperature, well over 122 degrees Fahrenheit, in less than 90 minutes. They were not just trying to keep the ship afloat, they were buying time with their own physical endurance. Every shovel of coal, every adjusted valve, every extra minute the electric lights stayed on up top meant more passengers could reach the lifeboats. The 8 engineers became the invisible anchor for everyone else's survival, isolated inside a compartment rapidly turning into a pressure chamber. The point of no return was not marked by a massive explosion, but by the quiet acceptance of an everyday command. At 1:45 in the morning, the scene on the top decks of the Steel Giant was defined by a quiet, heavily calculated urgency. The bow of the ocean liner was already pitched deep into the water, and the freezing ocean was creeping through the lavish first-class corridors. It systematically swallowed thick carpets, the dining rooms that, hours before, served exquisite 11-course meals, and the luxury of the mosaic-tiled Turkish baths. Outside, under a moonless sky, and a sea that looked like a deadly black mirror, First Officer William Murdoch was leading the lifeboat boarding on the starboard side. The math in that moment was brutally cold. There were over 2,000 people on board, and the launch davits held enough lifeboats for only about half of the passengers. Total panic, the kind that could flip the small wooden boats, was an imminent threat. To maintain order and keep the evacuation moving, Murdoch desperately needed one thing: light. Electricity was the thin line separating discipline from total terror in the middle of the North Atlantic. As long as there was power lighting the decks, there would be control. And for those lights to stay on, the ship's mechanical heart had to keep beating without missing a single pulse. Deep in the bowels of the ship, 65 feet below sea level, the engineering team was working in an environment pushing the absolute limits of human endurance. These were regular guys, scarred by soot and extreme fatigue, men with hard, unsmiling faces, fighting bravely while surrounded by 29 colossal furnaces. The freezing salt water, sitting at 28 degrees, violently hit boilers running under 215 pounds per square inch of pressure, throwing up a thick, choking fog. And it was at this exact critical moment that the grand architecture of the ship and the tactical desperation of the officers crossed paths in a way that could not be undone. If seawater rushed freely up the large ducts and wide staircases connecting the engine rooms to the upper decks, the ocean liner would rapidly lose the little buoyancy it had left. The decision made on the bridge was not in any routine manual or naval blueprint. The upper hatch, which served as the main access way and the last conceivable escape route for the engineers, was closed and sealed by a direct human order, not by the automated fire system. To grasp the magnitude and severity of what closing that passage meant, you have to understand the monumental, maze-like complexity of the ship. It goes way beyond the classic black and white photos. How did those intricate hallways actually connect? Where exactly were the boilers, the massive 1,000-ton engines and the electrical panels keeping the ship alive. If you want to visualize this structure in deep detail and dive into real documents, authentic maps, and the critical decisions that defined that night, we have prepared a special dossier, The Anatomy of the Giant Titanic. It is an exclusive ebook designed as a fully immersive visual guide packed with over 100 facts, unseen photos of objects recovered from the ocean floor, things like pocket watches frozen at the exact moment of the disaster, and shoes resting side by side in the ocean mud. It includes the blueprints that reveal the steel secrets of the ocean liner. The link to secure your access to this historical archive is pinned in the top comment right below the video. Going back to the harsh reality of that morning, historical records show that Murdoch's maneuver was cold, strategically exact, and from the viewpoint of saving the majority, totally necessary. By physically isolating the base of the ship, locking down the rising water in that critical sector, he significantly delayed the structural collapse. That lockdown bought the precious minutes needed for roughly 200 more people to reach the deck and board the final lifeboats. The officer was mathematically correct in his calculations of time, weight, and displacement. The practical result proved that the tactic actually worked for those up on the surface. But what makes this event a devastating turning point in the story is the human cost of what happened in the dark of the engine room. The 8 senior engineers were never warned that the metal door above their heads had been locked. There was no curfew bell, no alarm sounded, and no call down the acoustic tubes warning them that final containment was taking place. They kept running the heavy machinery, working the pressure valves, with the unshakable belief that once they stabilized the ship, they would have the right to climb those stairs and save themselves. They had no idea that the hatch separating them from the open sky was deadbolted. They did not know that the sacrifice of their own lives had already been decided and carried out by others without their consent. While the band played on the open decks and passengers said goodbye with the promise of seeing each other again, the engineering crew was quietly turned into the ultimate shield for the ocean liner. They were locked in a maze of iron, pressure, and freezing water, receiving absolutely no warning that this was irreversibly a one-way trip. The clock ticks relentlessly toward 2:17 in the morning. The upper deck of the luxury liner completely loses its level footing, turning a lavish promenade into a terrifying slanted slope. The bow of the ship has been totally swallowed by the ocean, slipping silently into the dark abyss, while the massive stern is lifted to the heavens at a terrifying 45-degree angle. High tensile steel, forged in the greatest shipyards on Earth to survive the worst storms, now lets out deep groans. It is the organic sound of a giant whose spine is being stretched way past its natural breaking point. For those watching in shock from the distant lifeboats, the ship looks like a monolithic black mountain cut out against the starry night. But the true climax of this story is not found in the visible panic on the surface. The essence of the sacrifice lives in the silence right before the end, trapped deep in the lowest levels, where the salt water finally overtakes the machine room. Down there, in the mechanical heart of the ship, reality is dictated by crushing physical pressure. The freezing water, at a stunning 28 degrees Fahrenheit, continues its methodical invasion, flooding the vast empty spaces and turning the thin air into a dense, damp, suffocating mass. The entire engineering crew, making up 35 highly skilled professionals dedicated to the engines and vital electrical grids, stood their ground from the exact second of the sideswipe. Out of those men, the 8 senior engineers directly in charge of the main boilers kept operating the massive pressure valves, completely submerged in water that now reached their chests. They worked in pitch black, guided by the instinct of their trade, by intuition forged from years at sea, and by the absolute technical need to keep the high-pressure boilers from causing a devastating internal blowout. The glow of the electric bulbs, which for hours symbolized order, hope, and civility for hundreds of fleeing passengers, started to flicker. Those lights, kept burning solely by the grueling, silent physical effort of the men down below, flashed one last time. At 2:18 in the morning, the power gives out and fails for good. The darkness that takes over the entire ocean liner is absolute, instant, and irreversible. This moment of pitch black marks the physical end of the human struggle against the crushing force of nature. Without any kind of light, with no communication lines and no accessible escape routes left, the isolation of the massive engine room becomes total. The upper access hatch, manually and mechanically locked almost half an hour earlier, did its cold, original job of containment. It sealed the water, and along with it, the men who were left behind. The room, now an iron and steel tomb, would never be opened again. And it is exactly in this window of time that history and eyewitness accounts record one of the most heartbreaking and emotional details of the entire tragedy. Jonathan Shepard, a junior assistant engineer, had been sent to the upper levels just 3 minutes before the final lockdown on an urgent run to grab heavy replacement tools. Hurrying back across the slanted deck, he ran straight into the impassable steel barrier. Standing on a severely angled floor, shrouded in the fresh darkness, Shepard stepped up to the heavy, sealed door. The terrifying silence following the blackout was shattered by a very specific sound coming from inside the flooded compartment. 4 metallic strikes, rhythmic, hard, and steady, echoing straight through the thick steel plate. In the unspoken language of the boiler rooms, and in British naval Morse code, those 4 strikes meant one final, ultimate message. Situation controlled. Even facing the inevitable end, with the internal water pressure becoming so violent it paralyzed all motor function, the men below signaled that their primary duty had been fulfilled to the very end. They had stabilized the safety valves. They had guaranteed every single second of time they could for the decks up above. The deep, distant sound of those 4 metallic strikes was the absolute last communication from that engine crew. Right after that, unforgiving physics took total and final control of the story. The weight of thousands of tons of trapped water in the bow yanked the massive structure downward with immeasurable gravity. At the same time, the elevated stern suffered colossal leverage, far beyond what the metal could ever take. The solid hull violently tore apart, with the massive break happening cleanly in the structure between the 3rd and 4th smokestacks. This critical structural collapse, backed by a mechanical roar that rolled like thunder across the surface of the ocean, marked the physical and permanent splitting of the ship's 2 halves. The grand naval architecture, which proudly pointed its 4 towering smokestacks to the sky, finally broke apart. The heavy bow, saturated and completely flooded, immediately plummeted down into the dark abyss. In an almost hypnotic motion, the stern dropped briefly back to the waterline, only to tip up from the impact and be dragged down, vertically and completely right after. The crushing dive into the night waters happened without any massive explosions from below, proving that the sacrifice and manual labor carried out until 2:18 in the morning accomplished its silent goal. Those worn, everyday professionals did not just keep the giant machinery under absolute control. They chose to face the ocean on their own terms, meeting their end in the name of an unshakable duty, leaving behind only the permanent memory of that final metallic sound echoing in the biting silence of the Atlantic. 114 years have passed since the freezing waters swallowed the steel giant. Today, at an almost unimaginable depth of over 12,460 feet, the scene is ruled by an abyssal silence and a darkness the sun can never pierce. That underwater tomb is not frozen in time. It is slowly being eaten away. Rust formations, known as rusticles, hang from the hull like living stalactites. They are the result of the relentless work of iron-eating bacteria, which inch by inch are erasing what is left of the greatest engineering marvel of its time. Researchers predict that, in just a few decades, the Colossus will vanish completely, taken back by the nature that claimed it. But even with the heavy decay, there are sanctuaries inside the hull that remain untouched. Since the day of the disaster, no human or robotic expedition has managed to physically break in and map out the entire inside of the engine room. The containment hatches, those same ones that dropped to seal the compartment during the night of the crash, are still locked. The tangle of collapsed pipes and twisted steel blocks any safe entry. However, modern technology has managed to shine a light where cameras could never reach. In the year 2010, ultra-high-resolution sonar sweeps scanned through the metallic wreckage. The acoustic pulses mapped out the internal terrain with pinpoint accuracy, revealing what lay behind those heavy, sealed doors. And what researchers found down there holds a solemnity that commands deep respect. The acoustic imaging picked up 8 symmetrical metallic shapes. They were not tossed around at random or dragged away by the ocean currents. These 8 silhouettes were mapped out in specific operational spots, positioned exactly around the furnaces and boilers that still stand on the ocean floor. It is the silent proof that those professionals never tried to run when the power failed. They stayed right at their workstations until the ocean swallowed the space completely. They met their end exactly where their duty placed them. To really understand the scope of these sonar scans and see how the ocean floor preserved these details with such surgical precision, we put together some incredible visual material. In the ebook, The Anatomy of the Giant Titanic, you will find not just expedition maps and boiler diagrams, but a full dossier on the current state of the ship. It is an essential archive for anyone who wants to preserve this memory before the ocean erases it for good. The link to grab this exclusive material is pinned in the top comment right below the video. How many other sealed compartments in lost ships across the oceans still hold the stories of entire crews that never backed down? Men operating critical emergency systems while the world above them followed protocols that never gave a thought to who would be left behind. The calm, dark water covering the North Atlantic today offers no hints of the sacrifice that happened there. It simply guards, in total silence, the secret of those who chose to keep the lights on, even when they knew the dark was inevitable. More than a century has passed since the last light in the engine room went out, but the weight of those hours does not rest solely on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. The legacy of the 8 senior engineers outlived the ship and shaped the future of sailing. When naval engineering had to face the invisible flaw that doomed the tech crew, the answer came in safety updates. But the backbone of the containment system remains terrifyingly familiar. Today, the International Maritime Organization still bases its sealing protocols on the technical manual from 1911. The structural logic has not changed. Sacrifice isolated lower compartments to guarantee the buoyancy of the ship and the safety of the people on the upper decks. The major shift, forced by the painful lessons of that April morning, was a strict mandate that all emergency hatches on the lower levels must have a manual internal release mechanism, a feature designed to stop engineers from being trapped against their will in case automated systems locked down the sector. Human life was, in theory, put on the same level as mechanical integrity. People were finally guaranteed a chance to escape toward the lifeboats. Yet modern history insists on showing a deeply disturbing pattern. when we look at the official records of 140 commercial ships that sank rapidly, going down in under 3 hours between 1950 and 2023, one specific fact stands out in the silence of the black boxes. In absolutely none of these modern tragedies were the internal emergency release mechanisms ever pulled by the engineering crews. The protocol is there, the hatches are installed, and the crews are trained for escape. Yet, when water violently breaches the lower levels, the outcome of the past insists on repeating itself. Men and women who understand the beating heart of the ship continue to stay behind. They choose to try and stabilize the generators and pumps until the absolute last second, holding off their own escape to guarantee those extra minutes of electricity that power rescues on the upper decks. The instinct of those 8 engineers in the North Atlantic became the unwritten rule of the trade, an invisible code of honor that defies every basic instinct of self-preservation. Even if technology evolved enough to build theoretically foolproof escape routes, human commitment remains fiercely insubordinate to safety manuals. The technical system hands them the key to escape the freezing water, but the weight of responsibility locks the door from the inside. The haunting question that still echoes is not about mechanical failures. What we still cannot answer, more than a century later, is the exact force that makes a human being decide, in a fraction of a second, that saving strangers is worth the price of their own definitive darkness. Thank you for joining us in this historical reconstruction. If this narrative changed how you see the priceless value of these invisible crews, leave your mark by subscribing to the channel. History is vast, and the next archive is already being prepared. Until then,